So today's video is a little bit different than what I've been doing here on the channel so far. First thing you can notice is that it's quite a bit longer, but the second biggest difference is that there's actually going to be somebody else doing most of the talking on today's video. It's actually an interview, and I plan to do more of them here on the channel in the future. Got some really cool folks lined up that I've been talking to about interviewing, but today what we're starting with is a super interesting guy named Steve Sanchez, who is an agave and cactus farmer and agricultural consultant in Southern California. He talks about how his family has been involved in farming agave in Mexico for generations, and how he has gotten into farming agave, different species of agave and stuff like that in California, and working with other farms and landowners that want to get into farming. And he comes from a really interesting perspective. And I talk about this in the interview, but I come from a collector's perspective, and I imagine a lot of the folks watching this do too, where we, know about all the rare agaves that we can keep, in pots in our house or outside in the greenhouse. But this is actually about the things you can make with agave, the commercial uses of agave, and what I call crop agave in this video, right? And specifically what the future of, or the potential future of agave utahensis for this kind of work is. And I think it's super interesting. We talk about tequila, obviously, mezcal, pulque. We even get into some of the edible uses for agave, some of the environmental considerations, some of the, considerations around protecting wild agaves. And like I said, what utahensis can bring to this whole equation. And again, Steve's depth of knowledge is absolutely incredible. I'm super excited that he agreed to do this interview with me. And I'm really excited to bring this content to all the viewers today. So thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy it. This is the first time I'm doing an interview. I hope to do more of them in the future, primarily for YouTube, with some interesting voices, mostly that I've kind of got to meet in social media. And one of the most interesting that I've heard so far, voices that I've heard so far, messages, stories that I've heard so far, is joining us today, Steve Sanchez, who's an agave and cactus farmer. You can find him on Instagram at Farming and Gardening California. And what I find just super interesting about your take is that I come from, first of all, I'm a newbie to all this stuff, but I come from obviously a collector's point of view, right? Like for having pretty ornamental plants. And with agave, there's this whole
that side too.
Nice. And with agave, there's this whole other sort of, production. And so in a lot of the questions that I have, you're gonna hear me say stuff like crop agave, right? And what I mean by that is like agave for, commercial use, or however you want to phrase that, like farming agave.
It's mainly been ornamental like purposes, like all of this, like using it as a crop is really new,
Yep.
Yeah.
In California though, right? Like it's been a crop.
Yeah, it's been a crop for, pulque, which is the simplest, I guess, form of making, agave into a alcohol. Like there's a lot of agaves that you could just cut the heart of it, the main one being agave salmiana and its subspecies. And, you could core the heart out, and that'll fill up with liquid every day that you could scoop out. And we call that in Spanish aguamiel. So usually that's like, 1% alcohol. It's just really, really sweet, kind of like honey. But if you leave that for a few days with just the natural yeast in the air, you'll eventually get pulque. So pulque has a history going back, if I remember correctly, at least like 6,000 to 8,000 years old, maybe even a little older. But that came before tequila and a lot of using it as a crop, right? Like they used it for like more ceremonial kind of purposes back in the day. Yeah.
I haven't had I've heard of pulque before. I haven't had the opportunity to try it. I believe it's mostly unpasteurized, and so it wouldn't really travel well.
Yeah. It's real
what
tough
percent
to find
alcohol
it.
is
You
it?
pretty much have to get it at it's mostly almost like a beer. So, depending on the pulquero, which is what we call like the person that, makes pulque, it could range anywhere from, 4 all the way up to 8 or 9%. So I kind of compare it to a beer. On the higher end, it might be like an IPA beer. Yeah. and it kind of is in that sense that it's very uh, organic, kind of like an IPA where you taste a lot of the hops, except you taste a lot of the agave and in the pulque kind of version of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a big beer nerd, and like one of the categories of beer, of course, is like sour beers and wild fermented beers that have other bacteria and wild yeast and all that kind of stuff, like Brettanomyces, which is like a flaw in wine, but in some beers is good. And so I can only imagine
Totally.
what like a totally wild
Well,
fermented pulque tastes like. It's got to be amazing.
that's the cool part about pulque because there's no two pulques that you will ever try that are the same. So like for instance, beers are, every single distillery has like their chemist that wants every single beer to come out to taste the same. So when you go to the store, you find the beer that you like and you know exactly how it tastes, right? But in pulque, it's never like that. Every single time it's going to be different because you have a different temperature, a different yeast strains in the air at the time because of just climatic factors. So every pulque has a completely different taste, and it's like very terroir based because it's like based on the local yeast, So wherever you make it or you let it ferment is where it's going to gain its kind of character. So that's why I kind of like it a lot because I'm really into beer myself, like, and I kind of see pulque as like kind of almost the Mexican beer that's like a little bit healthier for you. A lot of people talk about like the probiotics in pulque and stuff, but it's still something that's so new. There's not much research behind it. So, a lot of that stuff is still kind of like just, you could say, opinions that people have behind it, right? Of how they feel on it. But that's why I, really like growing agave because I'm more of a person that likes making pulque than spirits. My grandpa was a pulquero in Jalisco. So, growing up, he would just always tell me like how to do it. And, I would be watching him how to do stuff like that. So that was like my first kind of goal with even just growing agave as a crop. I didn't want to grow like thousands of it at first. When I started in 2017, I almost started it kind of just like as a hobby for myself to make my own pulque, because I'm like, I like this stuff so much, but because it's so local based and it doesn't transport well, like it'll continue fermenting. So you really have to drink it within a day or two
You'll get a bottle
when
rocket.
it's ready.
If you don't, it'll explode the bottle, I would imagine.
Totally. So like the only pulques you'll find on the market are pulque distillates, which is something completely different because they're taking the pulque and treating it almost like a spirit. They're gonna run that through a still, and then they're getting a something that might be like anywhere from a 15 to 30%, averaging most of the time 20%. And like I said, pulque is much weaker. It's like a beer almost, So it's something that you can enjoy and you can just keep going on with your day. Whereas the spirit, it's like you got to kind of commit to it that you want to drink it, right?
Yeah, no,
it's gonna go on you. Yeah.
I've been, like I said, 'cause I'm a beer nerd and I'm just interested in alcohols from different cultures. Like there's a Eastern European thing called kvass, which sounds like, again, I've never had that one either because it's real similar. It's sold in carts, like on the side of the road. It's still fermenting, so it doesn't travel well.
That's how pulque is right now.
Yeah.
It's still not even popularized at all. Like even in Mexico, very few people have like drinking pulque because you kind of have to know the farmer type of thing, And in Jalisco and Oaxaca, you'll meet a lot of people because there's just more prevalence of distillers that are familiar with it,
We have some friends that went down and got married on an agave farm and the groom is Mexican, and so they were talking. They're like, oh, what do you want us to bring back? Because we couldn't go because we got the little one, but like, what do you want us to bring
Yeah.
back for you? Et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, pulque, and they were like, what? They didn't even know what it was, and I was like, no, pulque.
Yeah.
Ask somebody, go find it. And apparently they did. They asked their family, and they like took them to like a roadside thing, and they got some, and they said it was weird because they're not into sour beers like I am or anything, but unfortunately couldn't bring it back. But so you said you got into
like
it.
The grand history of pulque, but when I started gardening around the same time that I started my farm, like 2016, and I started collecting agaves. I kind of got into the collector side of it, and it was funny comparing like my family history of like just one crop. Like in Jalisco, everybody just grows agave tequiliana. So when I am looking over here in California at like these collectors that have 1,000 different agaves, just a couple of each, I thought it was so interesting because in my head I was just like, oh, I wonder if any of those could be crops, and a large majority of them definitely can be after like years of just looking at what people have and me planting it just as a test too. But yeah, there's a lot of just collectors in California, on agave for like the past couple decades. But the farming is very new. Like I said, from maybe like I know of a few people that started experimental farms like me in 2016. I started in 2017, and they were up in NorCal. I was down in SoCal, and they were kind of doing it as the same thing. They were just like, let me have this hobby. Let me see if I can make the equivalent of a tequila in California, a California agave spirit. And, my experiments ended up panning out very well as theirs did. And I say they panned out well because we pretty much proved that you could grow lots of agave species to maturity and utilize them, so I mean, people made all types of different products already from it in California.
So that's one thing that I definitely want to get into more with you is like, what does maturity mean in it? But before we get too far down that, you've talked a little bit about your background and how you got into it in 2017, but I'd love to hear more about that. Like, what were you doing before that? How did you and again, you've started up a little bit of it, but I kind of want to hear more about your background and how you got into agave farming.
Well, I got into agave because, like, my family still, like my uncle, my cousins, and my dad, they're actively like involved in farming agave in Jalisco right now. So from my grandpa, we kind of had always small scale, just a couple acres of cows, corn, and agave. So we kind of had it as sustenance. We had it like, the cows and produce your own food. And the agaves was kind of like this pet thing that you had on the side just to make your pulque or your spirits once in a while so you and your family could enjoy. And I mean, there was thousands upon thousands of small distilleries like that that are less prevalent now. But my family was always involved with it, but my first experience with it was in gardening and just taking care of it on these big properties. And that's where I got to know all the different species because, these for lack of description, really rich clients of mine, they didn't want an agave Americana, just the common agave. They were collectors by themselves. They wanted a hillside of one or two of every single agave that I could feasibly find, and I would start creating agave and cactus gardens that, had all these different species. And in the back of my head, like I said, I always had, I wonder what you could do with some of these, and then when I was maybe 18, I went to Mexico and I stayed over there for maybe 3 months, working with my family in agriculture. And, I was working the agave farms, And it was something really interesting because today we have an agave industry that's really gigantic, and tequila sales are in the billions in the United States. So you would think, oh, agave farmers are making lots of money, but they don't really make the majority of the money from a tequila boom. Farmers make just I would say a decent wage. But when I was 18, which was 12 years ago, agave was at a such a low price that we actually lost double the money harvesting it than the plant paid us. So today we actually, like, my family makes money farming agave, and that wasn't the case before. It was kind of just like we did it as a tradition thing. We just wanted to maintain the tradition of making pulque, spirits, and growing agave. But then what I started to realize working on these farms was there was like huge issues with disease, and I started reading more into it and realizing that a lot of the farms were basic, like the majority of agave farms in Jalisco are Agave tequiliana, and they're mostly all clones of one mother plant. So they mostly all hold like similar genetics. So whenever one plague starts in one place, it pretty much spreads everywhere, and it devastates a lot of stuff quickly. And then when I started comparing like my stuff in gardening, like, oh, there's all these different species, and then I was seeing in Mexico like this monoculture, I was just like, man, like why are they doing this if there's hundreds, if not thousands, when you include hybrids of agave species that could be utilized? Why were they choosing to suffer in like a monoculture system that was just a bust and boom? It would be like the price of agave would be really good, and there would be no disease, and everybody would make money. And then other years it would be like nobody made money, and lots of farms had plague, and people were literally going bankrupt. So in the past 2 decades, like we've lost like 80 or 90% of agave farmers in the Jalisco region. So there used to be like maybe like 20 or 25,000 families that grew agave, and now there's like 2,000. So it's like consolidated extremely, and it's just big players, and then it's just kind of like really small families like mine that just have a few acres that they sustain themselves on.
So why do you think it is all that monoculture? Just because it's easier to propagate via clones, via I'm gonna mess up the pronunciation, but Hijos,
the Hijuelos. Yeah.
Wait, okay, yeah, the babies.
It's super easy to propagate by clone for them. So throughout a lifetime they might be getting like Agave tequiliana was chosen for that purpose. It's such a high pupper that they're able to get in that lifetime of that agave sometimes 50 or 100 pups. So in a field, that they plant, say 1,000, they might be getting, 100,000 within the maturity of that field in pups. So most of the time, they don't even know what to do with them. So they end up selling them, at a low price everywhere else. And that kind of just perpetuates the problem, because it's just like clones just keep being pushed further and further into other places that they weren't before.
And so, what do you think? What do you think could be a response to that? A solution? I mean, I've seen you with the plants that produce thousands of bulbils, because those are the result of sexual reproduction, right? I mean, those are all different genetics, technically, I believe. They're not just clones. So I mean, is that
bulbs are the bulbs have slight variations. So I was reading a report on I think it was from the University of Guadalajara, about this woman researcher who, she was talking about some really good stuff, that had to do with that. I'm trying to remember exactly what she was saying, but she was like, the point that she was mostly trying to make is that it's just so easy for the people in the area to reproduce by clone that they don't even choose to let the Agave tequiliana naturally bulb or naturally seed, and then replant those bulbs and seeds. So, but then in her research, she noted that the clones are genetic, identical to the mothers. The bulbs have just maybe like, a slight genetic variant. So they're pretty much like 95% clone. And the seeds, that's where you can have sometimes up to a 10 or a 15% variance from the mother. So really the best way to promote genetics would just be to be always perpetually planting seed. And, you would choose your best agaves and make them seed. And instead of letting them go into the distillery, you would choose to propagate them and continue that. Choose the best ones and the best ones. And that's what I'm trying to do. Yeah. Like
is
eventually
tissue culturing
with time,
playing a... Is tissue...
I mean, tissue culture is going to be big, I think. It's not so big in Mexico because, like I said, it's like they're like, why invest in millions of dollars in labs when we got millions of clones, if not billions of clones? Like there's, mountains of these stacked up sometimes, and they have nowhere to go, so they just rot, so there's just an extreme amount of them. But yeah, I think it's extremely important to further the genetics through seed propagation. That's going to be my main bet on propagating agave. It's just that it takes so long that a lot of the agaves I'm having to let some of them go to bulb to kind of like be able to have like instead of just choosing one thing, like I replant the pups, I replant the bulbs, and then I collect the seed and I'll plant the seed. So instead of choosing just one, I go for all three ways of reproduction. And I think that it's going to be the best business decision for a farm. But as far as genetics, yeah, it's no doubt that the only way to further the genetics is through seed. And really cross-pollination too, through hybridization, because that's going to be another way that you can introduce new genetics into them, that are going to have like, instead of a slight genetic variation, you're going to have like a 50% genetic variation where they mix the genes. So,
and that's as somebody obviously who's a utahensis nerd, and we've talked about this a little bit. I think we're going to get into it a little bit more in a second. I think that's a fascinating thing, is what can utahensis bring to that equation. One thing I do want to kind of circle back to before we get to that, though, this idea of maturity when it comes to harvesting agave. Right. What does that mean? Because I've studied a little bit how indigenous folks here used it. You use maturity, but how does it work in this context?
It's a controversial question because it has a lot of different meanings to a lot of different people. So like the first thing would be every agave species has a different maturity rate. And when I mean maturity rate, I mean how many years does it take to go from seed to bloom. So the best maturity and the ripest agaves that are used for distillation are going to be Capone style, which is basically Capone is, translated would be like castrated. So instead of letting these agaves bloom, and use the sugars that are in the agave and concentrate that into the stock, they basically cut the stock off and let that, sugar concentrate in the piña and ripen further, and not completely rot. It's like a fine line, like they look for certain cues like red or brown spots on the piña that might signify like ultimate ripeness, so it might be 5 to 9 years for agave tequiliana. And why I say 5 to 9 is because in some climates, they could be growing it so good that in 5 years they literally have a great agave that's pulling amazing bricks, and they can make it happen. for distillation, and it's mature and
And
ripe.
when
But
you
then
say
other,
bricks there, sorry to cut you off, because
yeah,
being that I'm an alcohol nerd, I know bricks is like a measure of
yeah.
sugar
Oh
content,
well, yeah. A
but it
lot
can
of
be
people don't know
confusing, I
what
think.
bricks
Yeah,
is. You're
yeah,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So bricks is like the measure of like, sugar content. So in distillation, you want to have the maximum amount of, distillable sugars. And if you don't have a high bricks or a high sugar content in your agave, it's pretty worthless. So when I say that they're ripe and mature, some of these agaves might be pulling anywhere from 25 to 40, 42 bricks is some of the highest that I've seen. And the best tequilas, the best brands, and the highest rated bottles, they're gonna have the highest bricks because the best distillers, they look for the best agave. It's like a chef in Beverly Hills. He wants to have the best ingredients to be able to produce the best dish. It's the same way with distillers. So they look for the ripeness based on bricks, not necessarily age. And on the high limit of 9 years, it might be due to somebody like me that's dry farming it, and it's just going to take longer to mature. But then the weird part about that is that that's just for agave tequiliana. Agave Montana might take you 10, 14 years. Utahensis might take you 15. I've seen agave Americanas the size of a truck that, I've seen people have them in their yards, and they show me pictures that they planted it 25 years ago. So it's like some of these agave Americanas, I'm planting them on 12, 14-foot spacing, and I'm just like, I'm not going to harvest them like they do in Jalisco with a koa, which is a sharp kind of like, tool that they use to cut the piñas up. I'm going to pretty much have to use an excavator for some of these agaves, right? So it could take, on some of these agaves, a decade or 2 or 3. And that all goes into the price of the bottle too, because some of the agaves that take, for instance, 15 years, like agave, its nickname is Tobalá in Mexico, but I think it's Potatorum in English. Well, I'm not still certain, I don't remember exactly, but you can Google it and it'll show you the actual Latin name to it. And those could take, like I said, 15 to 20 years. So those bottles obviously aren't going to be your usual $40 to $70 tequila bottle. They might be sometimes ranging $150 to $200 a bottle. And if you could find a Tobler for $100, man, like, check the brand out, because a lot of those agaves, they take so long that a lot of people aren't going to compromise so much on the price, that's why the maturity is a controversial question.
I've been doing some research trying to generalize and trying to understand that time from seed to flower, and I've even found some stuff about agave dessert eye, where they're estimating it out to 50 years and stuff. Out in the wild, where it's not being watered, it's not being cultivated, anything like that.
I forgot to mention too, like, another reason why the maturity question is very controversial is because a large majority of, not a large majority, but a significant amount of the large brands in Mexico producing tequila are starting to use, what they're calling a diffuser, which is allowing them to use sometimes agaves that are only 2 to 3 years old and nowhere near mature, but they're able to run them through a hydrolysis kind of chemical wash and basically take out the sugars out of this really young agave. And some of the brands that do that are selling some really expensive bottles, and the reason they're able to do that is because the diffuser completely takes away a lot of the bite behind the tequila. So it's like, I would almost compare it to like a vodka, because you're drinking something that's so smooth and has no taste, whereas in agave spirit, no matter if it's tequila, mezcal, or anything from any other country, it has so many notes that almost the whole point of drinking it. You know, it's like a fine wine. You want to be able to taste all that. And like I was telling you with pulque, it's similar in spirits where there's no two spirits that should taste the same unless they're being made at an industrial way, you know, with diffusers or really shady shit. So that just is why it's also a really controversial thing, the maturity on the agaves, because a lot of the traditional producers that have made tequila, you could say, like the way their grandparents or their ancestors made it, they're kind of like a really small portion of the market, whereas the diffuser and you know, that's taking over the market. And even in Mexico, it's really popular, like diffuser tequilas, you know. But yeah,
I'd never heard of that. Now, how do you measure the bricks of like a growing plant? Do you take a sample, because it's a refractometer that you use? Or?
Yeah, you could take a core of the heart, and you know, it's just like a small sliver, like maybe the size of a quarter, and you can use a refractometer and it'll read it for you. And you know, you want to take multiple readings, you know, when you're harvesting it, but you can just take a couple here and there if you want to just test the bricks like as it's growing. Like for instance, I on some of my larger ones, I've tested the bricks just to see if they're at a distillable you know, level. Like for instance, some of my agave americanas are, you know, the size of what an agave tequiliana would be harvested at, but they're only 7 years, nowhere near their prime maturity. But you know, I've pulled some pretty high bricks on them, and that's why I think agave americana and these longer aged agaves are interesting on marketability, because if they have high bricks and they're nowhere near mature, that means you could play the market. Like you could say, oh, okay, well, you know, if this is a good year that distillers are paying for the agave, I will sell it. And if it's not, I'm gonna wait till next year. Oh, it's not good, we'll sell it in 2 years, because you can just count on that agave getting bigger and maintaining a similar bricks, or we'll get a higher bricks, because you know it's nowhere near its age in years, right? So that's an interesting part about those. Yeah.
Does bricks go up dramatically when flowering happens? Like you mentioned the Capone method. That's always kind of what I imagine.
Yeah. Okay. The opposite. When the flower blooms, from what I understand, and a lot of, you know, researchers say it, the sugars, which are, you know, what the bricks is going to be reading, start to concentrate in the stock, and then they shoot up with that stock. So when you Capone the agave, you're basically like not allowing it to reorganize its sugars into that stock. And sometimes they might even get auxiliary stocks, though. That's some we've talked about, right? But
yep.
Most of the time, they're just waiting on it to just kind of like almost like avocado, you know. It's like you want to just let it get to its prime ripeness, you know, and they'll let them sit in the ground sometimes up to a whole year that way. Oh, wow. And just wait until they see those brown or those red spots that indicate, you know, prime ripeness on it. And like I said, it's a fine line, because prime ripe in another 6 months is rot, you know, is rotten. So it's a fine line, and that's why, you know, anybody that farms agave is constantly looking at their plants. Yeah.
Awesome. So another
much
thing,
like collectors, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, in my research, indigenous folks around this area who lived where utahensis and ate utahensis, they waited to the springtime, and they harvested when the stalks were, they would say, like waist high, essentially, is what the oral tradition comes down to us as. So they weren't cutting the stalk off, but they were harvesting it before it shot all the sugars into the stalk, and then just using it then in the springtime. Yeah. So I think that's really similar, because otherwise they said it would be bitter and inedible, essentially.
I tried a few pieces of a utahensis from one of my friends. I forgot the tribe that he's in, but they are one of those tribes that actually continues to use utahensis, like in, you know, a traditional way where they harvest it and their whole family utilizes the whole agave, you know. And it's interesting because in Mexico we do the same thing, but you know, these are giant agaves, so it's something completely different. But what I will mention is that agave utahensis tasted completely different to agave tequiliana. So it's like, you know, agave tequiliana kind of tasted like a sweet potato, and agave utahensis kind of, yeah, I don't know, it's like a more bitter sweet potato to me, but I really liked it. I liked it more than the tequiliana. Yeah.
I've never tried it, but what I've read again from the oral tradition is yeah, sweet potato is the first one that comes up as a comparison, and then molasses a lot of the times. Apparently that
yeah, like kind of like honey. Yeah.
Yeah, that bitterness. I don't. In the readings, one thing that was really funny is that the indigenous folks would always have like some white guy would come into town and they would feed him this stuff, and then he would eat all of it, and there's all these fibers and stuff in it, and it would just destroy the stomach, and it would be like this horrible. You just have this angry diary entry, like, why'd you make me eat this?
You know, it's your gut bacteria is not used to it. Yeah. No, but what I mentioned is just that in my part of Mexico, in Jalisco, we roast the stalks, and you know, the flowers are picked and eaten as well, and you know, the hearts are eaten. So when I heard about people doing the same thing with utahensis, I started thinking in my head, like, not only can agave make spirits, but it's a food crop. You know what I mean? Like, if you could dry farm a lot of different agaves, and you know, they're all going to have different tastes, you know, that's a potential food crop. I'm not sure exactly how you would utilize it, but I'm sure there's definitely a market for that, because everybody that I know that's tasted it loves it. The problem is you can't readily like go buy an agave pina like, to cook it and you know, put it in your oven. So
especially
but I think one day you might be able to. So
yeah, especially utahensis right now. Like,
utahensis is difficult. Yeah,
I mean, to find something that big, you know, you're going to be paying a couple $100 for something this big.
Totally.
You know, if you're just buying it like
that's why I say it could be a huge delicacy, because you know, I do, you know, because I do a fair amount of agriculture consulting for, like, you know, vineyards, and I build agave and cactus farms, like active in the, you know, the development of that stuff. But sorry, what did you just mention? I got another point in my head and I forgot it.
Just that it's super small, right? And so you'd have to buy a whole bunch of them, and then and right now the people that are producing them are producing them for collectors. Yeah.
So through just a lot of the farms that I talked to with consulting, I've like seen a lot of these really like niche farms that, like, you know, they make products like I wouldn't really think about. And you know, I always think about, you know, this one farm that I was reading about, and you know, my friend was working on as a consultant, and they were producing like truffles. And you know, that's something that I thought was only coming from, like, you know, Europe. And you know, truffles are kind of like this fungi that grows, you know, I think on like oak trees in Europe, but this company managed to grow them on pine trees here in America. And you know, they were selling this stuff like at $1,000 a pound, you know, and I'm just like, I think that's kind of like what agave utahensis, like if it ever was sold for consumption, would kind of be like, it would be like this super niche kind of like almost truffle, you know, that like would probably, you know, be only utilized by like very wealthy people, because they would, like you mentioned, it would, for a mature one, you know, you're probably looking at like a fair amount of money.
Yeah. And I've never chopped one down. I have some dried ones that are flowered and dead from last season outside my house. So I may chop it down at some point to see what the actual pina is inside of it. But I mean, the actual, you know, with the leaves and everything, it's maybe a foot across. The pina's got to be 6 inches, 8 inches, something like that inside of there.
Once you cut it down, it's like half or well, that's the thing that makes it really interesting, you know, like for growing them for spirits and stuff too, because out of an agave tequiliana mature, you might get, you know, sometimes 10, 15 bottles, but you know, out of one, these small, out of just one large pina.
Oh, I had no idea.
So it might Yeah, so like, it might take sometimes like 10, 11 pounds to make a bottle. So if you're pulling a 110-pound agave pina, you're around that like 10 bottle mark, and there could be some that are significantly larger than that.
Wow.
But I mentioned that because agave utahensis kind of reminds me a lot of like that tobala that I was mentioning, and those pinas when they harvest them are like, little, like maybe like a giant, like a softball,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that reflects in what they need to distill. They might need almost 7 agaves to just produce like one bottle. And that's, like I was mentioning, reflected in a lot of the pricing for them.
So one thing I think that's interesting that we've talked about a little bit, I would love to get into a little bit more before we dive even further into the utensils specifically, is so we've talked about agave farming for distillation for tequila. On the mezcal side, wild agaves, and I think you mentioned potatorum. I know there's some other ones that are harvested wild for mezcal. Can you talk a little bit more about how that works? There are challenges that are going on in that right now.
Well, it's it's kind of like frowned upon right now, to be honest. Like,
Even in Mexico where it's traditionally done?
Yeah, because like, well, there's two types of people. Like, there's people that, for instance, like they might own their family like 100 acres, and their land has these agaves naturally growing, so they can sustainably harvest, say, sometimes say like 10 to 30%, depending on how much they're propagating, and continually maintain that ecosystem of agave, right? It's just part of their land, right? And then there's a second group of people that are almost like poachers and poachers in one. They're literally scouting the land in the middle of the forest or the desert or wherever, and they'll see a hillside where there's a bunch of agaves, and then they'll buy that land and make, they'll make mezcal out of the kind of like these rare wild species that nobody messes with, and that's why they can demand good prices. And when they're finished with that, they're like, oh, well, this land is, we got all the agaves. Well, they'll cut down whatever the whole ecosystem is, whether it's desert or forest, and they'll just plant all espadín. So what's happening in Jalisco is actually starting to happen in Oaxaca. Whereas, like for instance, in Oaxaca, traditionally they might have used 30 or 40 different agaves in a sustainably manner where they just got a few, always planted a few, and they could always make these great spirits. Well, they've run into the problem of, the USA market. And now mezcal, I think last year made like $600 or $700 million in sales in America.
I think it's like the fastest growing spirit category here.
Yeah, they're like stripping complete ecosystems of forest and desert to plant espadín, monoculture of agave. And that is not only eliminating all the ecosystem for all those different wild agave species, but it's just like, destroying their ecosystem, because, when you take out all the trees and all this stuff that works together, they're losing their water resources. They're losing a lot of, their land to erosion. Like agave can actually help in erosion control, but not by itself. It needs to be planted in tandem with a lot of stuff. And yeah, it's not like the solution that they're looking for. Like they're falling into the same trap that Jalisco did. Because in Jalisco, like that's why I was telling you, I don't really agree with like even what my own family and some of the people in my city that I was born in, Mexico, do. Because you see, like on you'll go to the forest outside of the city that I was born in Aguascalientes, in Mercado, Jalisco. Beautiful forest. It's like a wonderland. And then you go like to the next hillside, and it's a whole hill from the bottom to the top mountain of agave. You know what I mean? Like, so it's like beautiful ecosystem, and then it's just blue agave.
And monoculture, everything's a clone.
Yeah. And now the same thing is happening in Oaxaca with Espadín agave. They're kind of, um, I would say, kind of getting greedy. Um, yeah, and that's causing a lot of issues. But mezcal, like I said, you can use probably, I mean, there's probably 80 to 100 different agaves that have been used in mezcales. So a lot of that knowledge and a lot of those smaller families that might have distilled those agaves are losing out to these big players that are moving into mezcal, because now that it's being boomed, you're having multinational companies, not only from America but from all over, come in and buy a small distillery and blow it up, and they want to do what they did with tequila, and that's personally what's always kind of angered me a bit behind tequila, because like I come from the agave farmer side, and I don't know any rich agave farmers, not one, but I know a lot of wealthy brand owners of tequila, and the majority of them are American, and I'm American too. I'm a dual citizen. I'm just saying that it kind of like, they lost a little bit of their culture because they got bought out, and the same thing's happening in Oaxaca. They're kind of just being bought out, and when you have these big companies come in, they don't want to produce 1,000 bottles. They want to produce 100,000, and that puts a huge, effect on the ecosystems that they have.
It sounds like at that scale it gets really extractive rather than sustainable, right? They're just sort of extracting the value from the land as hard as they can. One thing that I think is interesting to compare like the collector world and the farming world is that we hear a lot, and we can talk about this more too, but like poaching for collections, particularly of like Titanota, and stuff, and you hear about that in Mexico, happening in Mexico.
Very similar.
But do you think, I wonder if you have an opinion on this.
I've heard stories of, or sorry, finish real quick.
Do you think it's like, do you think there's a bigger threat to some of these rare species like Potatorum or Titanota from collectors or from farmers or from distillers?
Man, that's a good question.
Because I gotta think based on the scale
I'll tell
and the
you
amount
what,
of money
I know
involved,
that,
distilling has gotta be.
In Oaxaca and Jalisco, they have hillsides of just like for instance, mezcals are produced, like they can't hold the name mezcal, but like there's stuff that are agave spirits that aren't tequila made in Jalisco from a bunch of different agaves, just like they do in Oaxaca, right? So they just call it agave spirits, but it's what would be a mezcal. They're using a bunch of different species, roasting it in the ground. And a lot of these people, they literally, it's like top secret where this hillside of rare agave is, because people come in the middle of the night and harvest them all, take the whole hillside. And so it's hard to answer that question, because I've seen the same thing happen on my own land and to different landowners, where I had a beautiful hillside that had like 40 or 50 Echinocactus polysaphus and Theramedes subspecies, the reds, the orange, the yellow, the all gold, beautiful barrel cacti, right? Like when I bought this land, I bought this one piece because I love these cacti, and I was like, oh, I want to protect it. I showed up one day and the whole hillside's gone.
Wow.
So it's like I've seen it happen to other landowners, to me, and then I've seen it happen to farmers in Mexico where they take the whole hillside. So it's hard to say like what's worse, because they're like the same amount of messed up.
Yeah.
Because they can strip whole hillside of rare agave, or cactus in my case, and it's hard to catch them, because most of these areas are very, very remote.
Yeah.
And even in Mexico, like a lot of these agave farms are 3-4 hours off the beaten path, and the same thing, like some of these remote lands that I have, like you have to ATV 2 hours from the last road
Oh wow.
You know what I mean?
Okay.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
so it's like, yeah, like they s- they scout. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's a planned operation. It's not just a dude coming and
We're shoveling a
yeah,
duffel
I don't
bag.
know what happened to them, and then the same case in Mexican farmers. I don't know exactly what happens to those agaves, but a lot of people theorize like that they just go distill them, and they say, oh, we have this super rare agave that we distilled. You know, this bottle's super high price. You know, and that's you know, you can't really prove where that agave came from, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So a lot of the unregulated agave, it's hard to prove, but um, you know, when you're making tequila, they actually have every single field, and the agave is counted and marked by drone. So it's like they know exactly, like, you know, like the CRT, which is the regulatory body in Mexico of tequila. They know exactly, like when they look at a bottle, where all the agaves came from that went into that bottle, and that's yeah, that's crazy.
It sounds like I
Um,
worked in cannabis here in Nevada for a little while, and they have those seed to
it's very
sale.
similar.
They have the
Yeah.
seed to sale process where everything is RFID tagged and the whole, you know
Uh,
which plant, which batch, so
it's
there's
not
no
that
loss.
advanced, but
Yeah.
that's pretty similar. Yeah, that's like the best thing you could compare it to.
Yeah. We've talked about a bunch of different species. We talked about agave, utahensis, a little bit specifically, but I'd love to hear more what your thoughts are on like how agave utahensis could be used. We've talked about how it's a small plant, so it would be like a premium product, which I think is super
Yeah.
interesting. You know, what else could it bring to the equation? I know we've talked about like cold hardiness and stuff like that. What are your thoughts on the potential future of utahensis as a crop plant?
Well, I think that it's like you know, a very interesting plant, because a lot of the distillers that are here in California, um, they're looking for something that is gonna not only compete with California or with Mexican tequila or mezcal or raicilla, but best them. You know, like when I talk to some of these distillers, I tell them all the time, I'm like, we don't want to create some copycat stuff of Mexican brand, you know, because that makes us inferior. We want to make something that's completely better, that they're wanting to import our stuff, right? And the only way to do that is going to be to use agaves that are from here. Like they're using agaves that are from their areas. And, you know, the California people here, we're looking at, you know, Deserti, Shawi, Utahensis, you know, Americana, even though it's not a kind of native, it's naturalized. So it's like we're looking at all these species that are native here, to kind of serve as a base of that competitive spirit. You know, we want to show what not only you know, we can do as you could say a distiller or as a grower, but we want to be able to just, like I said, provide a competitive spirit that beats out whatever, you know, you put it against. And I think that utahensis is going to be a big part of that, because all of these agaves that are native to California, besides Shawi, that's coastal, are extremely hard. Most of them could be dry farmed. Most of them could take really cold temperatures, high elevations, really hot and windy climates. And that applies to a lot of the Southwest. So I think California is the start of something that's going to come to the whole Southwest. And I say that because, you know, working in agriculture consulting, people usually don't call me when stuff's going good. They call me when they're like super screwed against the wall. You know what I mean? I'm the guy that
Yep.
comes and they're like, you're our last hope. And like some of the farmers that I've worked with, like the state, you know, water in California is so crazy, water rights. But to simplify it, some of these farmers were paying millions of dollars to receive water from the state and got zero. So in drought years, their allocations, they had to continue to pay or they would lose seniority, but they received 0, 25, 50%.
Wow.
And a lot of them, you know, that was a lot of the work that I did, try to help them plant more drought tolerant grapes that might be from Israel or from areas that were, dry farming grapes. And now there's lots of vineyards in Napa that are dry farming grapes. And I see a lot of this agriculture in the whole Southwest having a lot of water pressure, and we don't have guaranteed water anymore how we used to. And most of the agriculture right now is highly dependent on groundwater. So it's like we're taking away from the future. We're already past like using whatever we get. We're now taking from the future. So, when I look at what are the future crops that the Southwest, I think are going to conquer the Southwest, I think agave is one of those big crops, because you can plant this in the majority of the Southwest states and dry farm it. And, I think that, for instance, I don't worry about what the state says about water. I dry farm. So, you could choose two ways to battle a lot of these water restrictions and stuff. You can say, okay, well, what can I do with my almond orchard or my winery or my vineyards? We could try to plant these different species and stuff, but if they continue cutting, you're eventually pushed against the edge one day to completely change crops.
Yeah.
And most of these people, they're going to have such low amount of the water that they used to have that, now that groundwater is being regulated too in California and most of the Southwest, they don't have access to the natural water that was falling, the water underground anymore. We're not building new dams and new water infrastructure readily. So if you're a new farm that's not in any of those water seniority rights, you basically have to plant something that's like agave or something that's a very drought tolerant crop, because you're already starting out with no water or very low water. And the people that are in agriculture now are going to be forced to either innovate in their niche or completely change, and I think a lot of them are going to completely change, because I'll give you an example. Solano County, they said that, they want their agriculture to cut 75%. And, they basically told them this kind of like 1 month to the other. And now it's kind of being debated, but there's a high chance it'll pass. And if that, water restriction were to pass in Solano County, California, this is a county that has thousands of vineyards, orchards. All of this stuff will be ripped out, all of it. And the most innovative farms will figure out a way to make it, but a lot of them won't make it. And the new entrants will have to be very innovative on water. So going back to your original question, is just like utahensis and a lot of these desert agaves that are native to the Southwest are going to be a prime crop to compete, because you could produce them. So it's like, do
the Mexican agaves, are they more water intensive than the Southwest agaves? Oh, okay.
Yeah, and they're also not as cold tolerant. So Agave tequiliana, it's cold tolerant to like 27. I've gotten it down with some shade cloths and like frost tarps down to like 18, but it's like, it's a very, like, I wouldn't want to scale that system. You get me? Because it's so easy to just plant another species that I don't have to do that. Yeah. So I think tequiliana and a lot of the Mexican varieties are going to be limited to like coastal, kind of like California. So they're not going to expand to where utahensis could go or Desserti, right? Obviously they're going to produce a much faster spirit, but what, like for instance, what I always think of is land prices. And land prices in coastal California are extremely expensive. So they're choosing a lot of the new entrants in agave farming to farm agave in some of the best agricultural land in California. Whereas, there's a lot of other people like me in the desert, And it's like we're choosing to turn something that didn't produce anything into something that's not producing something.
Yeah.
So it's like I almost kind of see it as a waste to plant a lot of agave in those areas that could produce stuff like, you know, like you could dry farm in Napa a lot of grapes and you know, have fruit trees and orchards, right? So it's like there's areas that can take this agriculture, right? You should farm to where you are.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like in my city, for instance, the majority of the farmers here are alfalfa farmers and grain farmers. Huge water suckers,
Yeah,
you
wow.
know, and
Wow.
yeah, I'm like complete opposite of that, you know. So I think that a lot of people, you know, talk to me and they watch my YouTube or Instagram. I might, you know, I probably had like 100 people, no joke, reach out to me like, oh, I bought some land, you know, in your area just so that I could start trying to see what I can experiment with. And
Mm-hmm.
it's cool. Some of them are growing vegetables, some are growing agave, cactus, animals. And I think that's great because what agave is kind of just proving to a lot of people is that the desert can produce, you know, and a lot of people don't see it that way, you know. They think they can only farm in like prime time lands, you know.
And
And
I
I
think
mentioned the land price because, yeah, a lot of these desert lands are very low valued and, in my opinion, undervalued for their potential to do this crop, you know. Because if you, for instance, are buying some of the lands in the Southwest at 5,000-10,000 an acre, you know, yeah, they have a huge potential to farm agave and cactus because of what you potentially pull out of them every year, you know.
And one of the big things, and you know, we're in the Southwest, in the desert, and I think a lot of the lessons that we're learning now, that we're dealing with now with water and, you know, temperature, particularly water, there's going to be a much wider parts of the country and much wider parts of the world in the next 10, 20, 30 years that are
It's
going to
gonna
have to
hit
deal with that.
everybody. We were just the first ones.
Yeah. So the lessons that we're
Yeah.
learning here about, you know, aridification, desertification, as the climate changes, like these are going to be lessons that are going to have to carry on in a lot of other
I'm
places.
half Guatemalan, and it's interesting you mentioned that because even in Guatemala, it's like a rainforest. You know, it's like this tropical place. It's like now they have no consistent rain in many
Wow.
places,
Wow.
so they're having to use groundwater, where traditionally it was just off of rain. So it's like, you know, even as someone who's half Guatemalan, I'm like, man, they need to plant agave. You know, there's a lot of regions in Guatemala that are desertifying, and the agave could reverse that, you know, if planted with a lot of different other species too.
That's always
You know,
been
it
one
could
of my
be as one of the good crops.
one of my favorite things about Las Vegas is that, you know, people come here, they see stuff like the Bellagio fountains in this big city in the middle of the desert, and they're like, why would you do that? It seems like such a tremendous waste of water. We're actually one of the most water efficient
They're the
cities
best,
in
yeah.
the country, like in the world. Like we're a model for other countries, other places.
Mhm.
And I think, you know, dry farming like this with agave and the cactus and all that stuff is another example of that. Of the lessons we're learning here are gonna be super valuable in a lot of other places in the world pretty soon.
And that's why I think the collectors honestly are doing a really good job, because like in the grand scheme of things, because a lot of these collectors are the only people that are posting about many of these agave and cacti species that maybe nobody would have ever known about. And a lot of people, for instance, I'm starting to see in the past maybe 5-10 years opening up trichocereus farms, opening up like you know, you're farming on a smaller scale utahensis, I would say, even if you don't call it farming. But you know, if you've grown a whole bunch of agave, I call it farming. And it's like I
Nice.
know other people just focusing on Montana, agave Montana, and all of these little niche farms are popping up because one guy saw a collector's video maybe on Instagram or YouTube, like you or me or whoever, and they say, "Oh, I love agave Montana. Let me buy a few of those." They buy it and they love it, and they're like, "I'm gonna farm this. I'm gonna plant 1,000 of this. I'm gonna plant 10,000 of this."
Mm-hmm.
And all of these really niche farms are popping, I think, out of like the craze that's going on between a lot of this agave and cactus, you know, and that could be good and bad, but in that sense, I think it's really good that people are getting more into farming these things that would never be farmed. Like I know 1,000 plus maybe cacti, that fruit that nobody is farming, and like all of these agaves. Like I said, there's probably a dozen or two agave species that are like consistently farmed, like on a anywhere from 10 acre to 1,000 acre, right? But there's almost 200 species, and when you do the permutation and combinations on what you could do, man, there's like millions of what you could potentially create, right, over time. And that's what I'm always thinking of, like, man, there's so much stuff that you could do as far as like farming agave that nobody is getting into. Like we've kind of like, it's like the tip of the iceberg, and a lot of those collectors I think are inspiring people to do that, and
I hope so.
a lot of
I think another source of that kind of knowledge, I think, rather than looking to the collectors, who I think are the bleeding edge, the tip of the spear, right, is going back to a lot of the indigenous communities that used to live in these areas, or
totally.
still do, but used to either do forestry or wild harvesting, or actually do dry farming or different kinds of irrigation, and looking at what they were doing. And that's a big inspiration for me on the utahensis side, because there was at some point very large scale utahensis harvesting that happened.
Well, that's
at least here, and the populations are still super healthy.
That's where I'm learning a lot of my stuff, because it's like, I one of my majors was history. So like when I started getting into agave, I'm just like reading everything I can about agave. And the University of Arizona puts out a lot of really good stuff on agave.
Yep.
And when you go read a lot of the research behind the indigenous people and what they were utilizing a lot of the agaves, it's like we're not inventing new stuff. We're almost like just going back into the tradition, and like, oh, okay, they use the points of the leaves for needles. How could that be utilized? Or they use the fiber for thousands of different products. How could that be utilized? But until you read that stuff, you don't know, right? And every agave, like I said, has its own little twist on what types of stuff it could be utilized for. Like, I give you an example. Like one of my favorite agaves that I have like thousands of bulbs now and seeds that I'm propagating is the agave, the octopus agave vilmoreana. And this agave is, a particular importance to me, particularly because its leaves are some of the highest in saponin chemicals, which are irritant for your skin and stuff. But they have lots of I'm not a doctor or anything, but I've been reading lots of research that a lot of people are really like betting on saponins to be this big new field, and they're starting to get these saponins from like I think it was beans or legumes. But I was just sitting over here like, man, the saponins in agave could definitely go into biomedical research, and they're gonna need a bunch of that leaf to produce that, right? So it's like, I don't only think like that we should focus on agave to beat alcohol. Like there's like so much stuff that you could do with it, right? And one of the products in Mexico that's really getting popular right now is agave inulin, which is a dietary supplement that helps people with a lot of different stuff. So it's like agave is starting to be utilized for a lot of these things that the indigenous people started to utilize it for, and we're starting to go back into the history and take that, and some people are creating actual products out of it. Like I always think back to or I was gonna say that I always think back to even the the Aztec Codex that was written on agave paper. You know what I mean? So going back thousands of years, people have been using this product to make a bunch of innovative stuff. And it's like if you could dry farm agave, and create paper products, all types of stuff with it.
The saponin thing is super duper interesting. I was just reading a bunch of research about it. Apparently, they found it in other plants. It exists in a bunch of plants. It's like a stress mechanism or something.
Yeah.
But it's used in Chinese medicine from other plants. But even utahensis now has been like, there's been multiple studies done on anti-cancer, like it causes cell death in cancer cells.
Well, that's what the
Saponins.
research that I was reading about the
Yeah.
saponins, that just like there's all this research that is outcoming that, like that it's like this super like almost kind of like chemical, where like people are saying like it's anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer properties. It's like
Yep.
able to block like the for diabetics, like I don't remember or know exactly how to explain it, but it works with their insulin to kind of like block it to where they can actually like eat small amounts of sugar because their body isn't like receiving it or like acknowledging that they're receiving it, I guess.
And then
So
even
it has a lot of
fiber.
potential that's still being explored. Yeah.
Yeah, like fiber is a big traditional product. Sisal is agave fiber. A lot of folks don't know. I didn't know
I got a
that until
couple of
like the
those,
last
yeah.
year. That
I
sisal
got
is
a
just
couple
like
of those
that's
for that same
like
reason,
rugs
yeah.
are made from that.
Well,
And that's a big, like I would imagine that could be used as like a building block at some point too. You can make sisal concrete, I would imagine.
My grandpa, we would make sandals out of it,
Yep.
out of the fibers. And what I want to buy is an agave leaf processing machine that I've seen like a lot of people utilize or build one. And instead of doing what me and my grandpa would do, which is put it on a bunch of nails and try to strip the fibers like old school, these machines, you put the leaf in and it just strips all the fibers for you, and then you can hang them up to dry and utilize them. And we would make all types of products from them. We would make sandals and belts and hats, but like I said, because it's a fiber, you can utilize it for all types of stuff. And I've started to see that the agave salana is used actually in Africa to produce some like extremely high priced like fashion products, because it almost they say that when the certain way that they weave it, they say it's a higher quality than silk, so they're able to produce like some really high fashion products for people. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have the money to buy the stuff that they're selling, but it's like I was just interested because I'm just like, yeah, I'm over here like, oh, it's only good for kind of like t-shirts and kind of like simple stuff, but there's people making like fine garments, you could say, out of like this stuff too. So it could produce your socks and toilet paper, and it could go all the way up to producing dresses and tuxedos and stuff. So yeah, that potential is going to be explored by someone for sure. Yeah, definitely. And the thing that I've read a lot about the fiber, it's extremely like durable, like a lot of the comparisons that people put it up against is hemp, and it kills it in a lot of the different tests, like just blows it out the water on durability and flexibility and stuff. And that's what excites me because
Jute is another large fiber. Jute, which is grown primarily like in Bangladesh, East Bangladesh, which is like they have to grow it in grasslands, and it's like grown under the water, and it's like super water intensive. It's a very similar like fiber
agave,
product.
You don't even need a lot of water, and you can produce it.
Yeah.
That's the cool part. Yeah, I think the product list is almost unlimitless. That's why I tell everybody it's like the tip of the iceberg, because we have tequila and mezcal and raicilla and maybe this half dozen big spirits, but that's the tip of the iceberg as far as spirits. But that class as a whole is just the tip of the iceberg as far as products. Like, it's nothing compared to what people are gonna utilize this for in the future, I believe. Yeah.
Awesome.
And you just have to look at the past to see what people are going to utilize it for, I believe, like we were talking about.
Yeah. No, super amazing. Awesome. This has been outstanding. I love the conversation, love your perspective on it. I could keep going for another couple hours, but this is going to be one of my longest YouTube videos, or my longest YouTube video ever. So we might have to do a part 2 at some point in the future, but thanks so much for I learned a ton. I'm sure everybody watching this did too. So again, your Instagram is Farming and Gardening California. Where else are you on the internet? Where else can folks find you if they want to, if they have a farm they want to plant some stuff on?
I'm on YouTube as Agave Californiano, and then I'm on a bunch of different social medias. I think it's Farming and Gardening California, awesome. But yeah, you know, if anybody's interested in agave farming, you can definitely send me a message on Instagram. I'm usually on there quite a bit, responding to messages and stuff, and I try to respond to a lot of people when it's talk about agave, because I almost feel like I learn from their perspectives, because it's like, for instance, when I talk to you, it's like you're looking at agave from a completely different viewpoint than a lot of the people in Jalisco or Oaxaca, and like, you know, I learn a lot of stuff that you see the agave ads, right? So I think it's just, this is getting out to a lot more people, so it's good that agave is, you know, going out everywhere.
Heck yeah, awesome. Well, thank you again, and thanks everybody for watching.
Totally,
and I will
thanks.
I'll talk to you later.
All right, man, have a great night. Have a good one, everyone.